The unrecognizable body of an Italian countess was discovered in her own chambers, just a few meters from her bed. A widow from Dublin seemed to vanish in front of her fireplace. And a 70-year-old retiree mysteriously passed away in plain sight of terrified bystanders. All of them met one of the most mysterious deaths in human history. They became victims of spontaneous human combustion. But is such a phenomenon even real? Everything you're about to see has been recreated using mannequins and computer simulations to show you what really happened and to warn you about a possible danger. Viewer discretion is advised. On the evening of March 15th, Countess Cornelia Zangari Bondi appeared unusually somber. She was 66 years old, considered advanced age in the early 1700s. The Countess often drank strong alcohol and used camphor tinctures to ease her joint and muscle pain. That night, her maid escorted her to her room. But when she didn't wake up at her usual time the next morning, the maid went to check on her. The scene in the Countess's bedroom was horrifying. The room was filled with soot, and the furniture was coated with a thick layer of black, tar-like residue, but it remained intact. Just 3 feet from the bed lay a pile of ash and a few bone fragments, the only remnants of the Countess. Beside them, there was nothing but an empty oil lamp. This mysterious death was thoroughly studied, yet no natural explanation was ever found. Her contemporaries believed it was either divine punishment or the devil's work. However, 15 years later, a local poet, Paul Rowley, introduced the term spontaneous human combustion for the first time. As he claimed, this phenomenon occurs when a person bursts into flames without an external source of fire. Some even theorized that the fire originated inside the victim's body. It's believed this is what happened to Countess Zangari Bondi. Yet, a century and a half later, Victorian doctors suggested the cause wasn't supernatural, but rather tied to alcohol consumption. They argued that heavy drinkers might become more flammable due to the combustibility of alcohol. Still, spontaneous human combustion is extremely rare. Only about 100 potential cases have been documented throughout human history, and even modern science hasn't been able to fully explain any of them. One such case occurred on November 8, 1964, in a suburb of Philadelphia, where 51-year-old Helen Conway lived. Around 8:15 that morning, she asked her granddaughter to bring her a lighter from downstairs to her second-floor bedroom. Helen, a heavy smoker, often lit cigarettes while sitting in her chair. The granddaughter obliged, stayed with her briefly, and returned downstairs. 12 minutes later, a neighbor noticed flames shooting out of Helen's bedroom. He ran to help, but the heat on the second floor was unbearable, so he called the fire department. Firefighters arrived within 6 minutes, but in that short time, Helen's body had almost entirely burned. This was impossible since cremating bones into ash typically takes 2 to 3 hours in temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Moreover, only Helen's chair was burned. Nothing else in the room was affected. Of course, I can't show you actual photos from the scene of this or the other incidents, but links to all available evidence are provided in the video description. As for Helen Conway, neither the firefighters nor the police could explain what happened to her. Was it some extremely rare combination of circumstances and specific conditions with nothing mysterious at all? Let's try to find answers in the case of retired Dr. John Irving Bentley. Bentley lived in a small town in Pennsylvania and had been mostly immobile for 19 years due to a broken hip. By the time he was 92, he could only move with the help of a walker. Friends saw him alive and well one evening, but the next morning, a meter reader arrived to check on him. In the basement, the worker noticed a strange smell, light smoke in the air, and a small pile of ash about 30 centimeters wide. Concerned, he went upstairs to make sure Bentley was okay. In the bedroom, he found smoke-blackened walls, a hole in the floor, Bentley's walker lying across the opening, and part of Bentley's right leg still in its slipper. The rest of his body had turned to ash in the basement below. Horrified, the worker reported what he found. Bentley, a pipe smoker, often scorched his clothes with it. Firefighters assumed the fire started from the pipe, but it was found on its stand in the bedroom. However, there were matches in Bentley's robe pocket. It's possible that while cleaning out his pipe, a hot ember fell into his pocket and ignited the matches, setting the fabric on fire. Bentley's robe was found smoldering near the hole. But even if his clothing caught fire, why didn't he just remove it? And how could that explain the near-total cremation of his body? Some theories suggest Bentley might have lost consciousness before or after catching fire. The heat melted the linoleum floor, intensifying the flames. When the hole burned through the floor, a draft could have provided enough oxygen to sustain the fire. This still doesn't explain why the rubber tips on Bentley's walker, which were directly over the hole, didn't melt. The question of whether human bones could turn to ash in a fire confined solely to a human body remains unanswered. Another case that might shed light on the phenomenon happened in 1970 in Dublin, involving 89-year-old widow Margaret Hogan. Due to her age, Margaret could no longer manage household tasks alone, so her neighbor cared for her. On March 27th, the neighbor helped Margaret prepare for bed and left her in the chair by the fireplace, as she had many times before. The next morning, Margaret was found in the same chair, or rather, what was left of her. Most of her body, the chair, and the flooring beneath had turned to ash. The walls were coated in black, greasy soot, and a TV over 3.5 meters away had melted completely. Yet nothing else in the house was damaged. Investigators examined the scene and logically suspected the fireplace had caused the fire, but no evidence linked to the blaze that killed Margaret. The only clue was the testimony of a few witnesses who reported seeing a ball of light near Margaret's window. This could have been a reflection of the fire or a lightning strike, possibly even ball lightning. Ball lightning is an extremely rare and scientifically unproven phenomenon thought to occur naturally, often during thunderstorms. Victims struck by ordinary lightning are sometimes burned to ash, so it's conceivable this could explain Margaret Hogan's fate. Others have proposed wild theories, claiming suppressed emotions or depression could cause an internal explosion, or that solar flares and cosmic storms, or even intestinal bacteria producing flammable gases, were to blame. British author Michael Harrison, in his book Fire from Heaven, suggested poltergeists as the cause of spontaneous combustion. These so-called spirits are said to create loud noises, move objects, push people, and start fires. Of course, there's no evidence that poltergeists exist, and most supposed cases have been debunked as hoaxes. Could spontaneous human combustion also be nothing more than an elaborate myth? One September evening in 1982, Jean Lucille Saffin was sitting in the kitchen with her father and brother-in-law when she suddenly burst into flames. The men saw fire shooting out of her mouth, but there was no scream. Her father managed to extinguish the flames and called an ambulance. 8 days later, Jean passed away in the hospital from pneumonia caused by burns. Her grieving father claimed there were no sources of fire in the kitchen and that his daughter had breathed fire like a dragon, leaving her clothes intact. Could this really have been spontaneous human combustion? However, when official reports emerged, doubts arose. First, the police at the scene noted that Jean's clothing was burning. Second, doctors confirmed that most of her burns were caused by her nylon clothes melting onto her skin. Third, the tissues in her mouth were undamaged, proving the fire didn't originate internally. Additionally, her father's pipe was packed with fresh tobacco, suggesting he might have been cleaning it when an ember was carried by a draft onto Jean's flammable nylon clothes. This theory was partially supported by a scientific study 2 years later. Researchers analyzed 30 cases of alleged spontaneous combustion, finding real fire sources like candles, lamps, fireplaces, pipes, or cigarettes near almost every victim. The flames typically ignited clothes, blankets, or rugs, a rare condition called Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which causes severe burns and blisters, could be mistaken for spontaneous combustion, yet it wasn't relevant in Jean's case. Most victims of alleged spontaneous combustion share common traits. Take George Mott, a retired New York firefighter. George relied on oxygen therapy for respiratory issues and rarely left home. He also had a few bad habits. On March 26, 1986, George stopped answering his son's phone calls. When investigators entered his home, they found signs of combustion. Soot-covered surfaces, a melted TV, untouched furniture nearby, and a pile of ash, George's remains. Notably, George shared similar traits with other victims of suspected spontaneous combustion. They were elderly, often immobile due to age or health, frequently alone for long periods, and were smokers or heavy drinkers. Jean Lucille Saffin, who had cognitive impairments, functioned at a child's development level despite her age. This suggests that victims may have been incapacitated by poor health, heart attacks, or intoxication, leaving them unable to react or unaware of the fire. Pipes and cigarettes are common ignition sources, while an oxygen tank like George's could escalate the flames. But if we dismiss mystical explanations, how can a human body made up of 60 to 70% water burn to ash? it's time to explore cases investigated using advanced technology. December 22nd, 2010, Ireland. Michael Faraday, aged 76, was found lying on his back with his head near an open fireplace. Specifically, his body was almost entirely burned with charred flooring beneath. Investigators ruled out the fireplace as the ignition source. With no other evidence, the Irish coroner concluded this was a case of spontaneous human combustion. In fact, many things can ignite spontaneously without flames: coal dust, compost piles, and oil-soaked rags. Online videos show street experiments where people left oil-soaked clothes in the sun for 6 hours, resulting in ignition. The same applies to phosphorus solutions and derivatives. Another theory involves acetone, a volatile, flammable gas produced in large amounts by certain conditions like alcoholism, obesity, or low-carb diets. Could this cause spontaneous combustion? It seems plausible, but there's more. In 2015, in Flensburg, Germany, a woman sitting on a bench near a playground suddenly caught fire. She didn't make a sound as flames engulfed her. One quick-thinking bystander used his jacket to smother the fire while 2 other men ran away. Could they have caused the fire? The woman, around 40 years old, had immigrated from Mauritius long ago. Could this have been a hate crime or a tragic act of self-harm? Police seriously considered both theories. She was hospitalized in critical condition, but her fate remains unknown. A similar case occurred in Tottenham, England in 2017, with key differences. John Nolan, a 70-year-old retiree, was walking near a football stadium when he suddenly caught fire, shocking onlookers who tried to extinguish the flames and called for help. Despite suffering 65% burns, Nolan perished in the hospital the next day. Firefighters found no ignition sources, and detectives couldn't uncover any leads. No one approached Nolan or spoke to him, and he didn't harm himself. No flammable substances were found on his body. This fatal incident remains unexplained. So, is spontaneous human combustion a mystical phenomenon? Not quite. Scientists have developed and validated a theory explaining the most critical aspect of these cases: how human bodies can burn completely. The wick effect suggests that there is always an external ignition source, such as a cigarette or intense heat from a fireplace and an oil-soaked rag. Heat causes clothing to smolder, reaching the skin and charring it, exposing the fat underneath. The fat melts, soaking into the fabric, fueling the fire like a candle wick. BBC's Earth Science team demonstrated this with an experiment. They showed that a person's clothing or blanket could ignite from even a tiny fire source. Once the flame reaches subcutaneous fat, it sustains burning, potentially consuming the entire body. At the same time, the fire does not affect things around it. Yet in 2002, researchers at the University of Tennessee conducted a study that sheds light on the phenomenon. First, they found that the bones of patients with osteoporosis disintegrated faster in fire than those of healthy individuals. Second, the burning human tissues produce very little heat, preventing the flames from spreading to surrounding objects. These findings debunk much of the mystery surrounding spontaneous human combustion, but some cases remain unexplained. This phenomenon is still extremely rare. What do you think? Are these cases just natural events triggered by a perfect storm of factors? Or is there a supernatural force at play?